the Vanderbilts demolished their own palaces faster than weather or war ever could have done. Between 1920 and 1960, the family that had built the largest private homes in American history systematically tore them down to escape property taxes and maintenance costs that no fortune could sustain. 660 Fifth Avenue vanished in 1927, replaced by a department store that seemed more useful to modern Manhattan. Marble House stood empty for decades, its furnishings scattered at auction, its ballrooms silent and cold. The breakers survived only because the family gave it away, surrendering ownership to keep the walls standing at all. But in the Blue Ridge Mountains, one Vanderbilt heir found a different path, and the house he built remains in family hands today, the sole survivor of an empire that once seemed destined to last forever. The fortune that built Biltmore began with a ferryman who could barely read. Cornelius Vanderbilt was born in 1790, the ferrying Tad and Sanwing 1794 on Staten Island, to a family of Dutch farmers who had worked the same land for generations. He left school at 11 years old, not because his family could not afford education, but because he saw no point in it. By 16, he was operating his own boat, ferrying passengers and cargo across New York Harbor for pennies a trip. He was tall, profane, and utterly relentless. Competitors who challenged him found themselves undercut until they surrendered or went bankrupt. He had no education, no social connections, and no patience for anyone who stood in his way. The young Cornelius understood something that more refined businessmen often missed. Transportation was power. Whoever controlled the movement of goods and people controlled the economy itself. He started with a single periauger, a flat-bottomed sailboat common to the harbor. Within a decade, he owned a fleet. He expanded into steamships during the 1820s, slashing fares so dramatically that rivals called him a pirate. He did not care what they called him. He cared about winning. By the 1850s, Cornelius had moved from ferries to steamships to railroads. The Iron Horse was reshaping America, and Cornelius intended to ride it to dominance. He consolidated rail lines across the Northeast with the same brutal efficiency he had applied to harbor traffic. When the New York Central Railroad resisted his control, he simply refused to let his connecting lines accept their passengers. Travelers bound for New York found themselves stranded in Albany, unable to continue their journey. The Central stock collapsed within months. Cornelius bought it at a discount and merged it into his growing empire. His methods were legal, but ruthless. He bribed legislators when necessary. He manipulated stock prices without hesitation. He crushed smaller competitors and absorbed their assets. The newspapers alternately praised him as a titan of industry and condemned him as a robber baron. Cornelius ignored them all. He was building something that would outlast any headline. When Cornelius Vanderbilt died in January 1877, he left behind approximately $100 million. This was the largest fortune ever accumulated by an American up to that point. In an era when a skilled worker might earn $500 per year, this sum was almost incomprehensible. Adjusted for the size of the economy, it would exceed $200 billion in today's terms. He left nearly all of it to his eldest son, William Henry, believing that dividing the fortune would weaken it. His other children received comparative pittances. One son, Cornelius Jeremiah, had struggled with gambling debts and mental illness throughout his life. He received only the income from a $200,000 trust. He contested the will in a lawsuit that scandalized New York society for months. He lost. William Henry Vanderbilt proved even more capable than his father had predicted. Where Cornelius had been a builder and fighter, William was an administrator and consolidator. He lacked his father's volcanic temper and bare-knuckle instincts. What he possessed instead was a genius for organization. He streamlined the railroad operations, eliminating redundancies that had accumulated over decades of rapid expansion. He invested heavily in new equipment, replacing aging locomotives with modern machines. He expanded the network carefully, a acquiring only lines that would strengthen the whole. The results astonished even his admirers. By the time of his own death in December 1885, just 8 years after inheriting, William Henry had doubled the family fortune to approximately $200 million. He had become, by most measures, the richest man in the world. No European aristocrat, no ancient dynasty, no industrial competitor could match what the Vanderbilts had accumulated in just 2 generations. William Henry had 8 children, and unlike his father, he chose to divide the estate among them. Perhaps he feared the family conflicts that had followed the Commodore's concentrated bequest. Perhaps he believed the fortune had grown large enough to sustain division. Whatever his reasoning, each child received between $10 and $15 million outright, with additional amounts held in trust. These were still staggering sums. Any one of them could have funded a life of permanent leisure, could have purchased anything the world had to offer. But the Vanderbilt children did not want leisure. They wanted recognition. The problem was social acceptance. Despite their wealth, the Vanderbilts remained outsiders to old New York society. The families who had arrived generations earlier, the Astors and Livingstons and Schuylers, looked down on railroad money as vulgar and new. Mrs. Caroline Schermerhorn Astor, the self-appointed arbiter of New York society, maintained a guest list of exactly 400 names. The Vanderbilts were not on it. This exclusion burned. The 3rd generation set about building their way into respectability. If society would not accept them for their money, perhaps it would accept them for their monuments. The result was an explosion of construction unlike anything America had seen before or has seen since. Cornelius Vanderbilt II, the eldest grandson of the Commodore, built first. His mansion at West 57th Street covered an entire city block. When that proved insufficient to his ambitions, he tore it down and built an even larger one at 1660 Fifth Avenue. This second mansion contained 137 rooms, arranged around a central courtyard. Its entrance hall was modeled on the Château de Blois in France. Its grand staircase was carved from Caen stone imported from Normandy at staggering expense. The house required a staff of 30 servants simply to maintain basic operations. The annual cost of running it exceeded what most Americans would earn in several lifetimes. William Kissam Vanderbilt, another grandson, responded with his own campaign of construction. He built Marble House in Newport, Rhode Island, as a summer cottage for his wife Alva. The term cottage was a cruel joke. The structure cost $11 million to complete. Of this sum, approximately $7 million went to marble alone. The entrance hall featured walls of yellow sienna marble. The dining room glittered with bronze and gold. His wife Alva used the house as a weapon in her assault on New York society, hosting a costume ball in 1883 so lavish that Mrs. Astor could no longer ignore her. When the marriage ended in a scandalous divorce, Alva kept the house. William K. simply built another mansion nearby, even larger than the first. Cornelius II also built in Newport. The Breakers, completed in 1895, was an Italian Renaissance palace designed by Richard Morris Hunt. It sat on 13 acres overlooking the Atlantic Ocean. The structure contained 70 rooms and required a permanent staff of 40 servants to operate. The dining room alone could seat 200 guests beneath a ceiling painted to resemble an open sky. Throughout the house, platinum-covered fixtures and hardware, because platinum was rarer and therefore more expensive than gold. These mansions were not homes in any ordinary sense. They were statements of intent, weapons deployed in a campaign for social acceptance. The Vanderbilts built them to prove that new money could match old money stone for stone, room for room, artwork for artwork. Each generation tried to outdo the last. Each sibling tried to surpass the others. The houses grew larger, the materials more exotic, the art collections more impressive with every passing year. By the 1890s, the Vanderbilts owned more residential square footage than any private family in American history. But one member of the third generation showed little interest in this competition. George Washington Vanderbilt II was the youngest of William Henry's 8 children. Born in 1862, he grew up watching his older brother's frantic building campaigns from a comfortable distance. Where Cornelius II and William K. were gregarious and socially ambitious, George was quiet and bookish. He spoke 8 languages fluently. He collected rare manuscripts and first editions. He preferred libraries to ballrooms and solitary study to social conquest. Contemporary accounts describe George as slight in build, gentle in manner, and almost painfully shy in company. He never married until he was 35, an unusually late age for a man of his wealth and position. He showed no interest in the railroad business that had created the family fortune. He displayed even less interest in the competitive display that consumed his brothers. When he came into his inheritance at 21, receiving approximately $10 million outright plus substantial income from trust funds, he did not rush to build a Fifth Avenue palazzo. Instead, he traveled. George spent years visiting the great estates of England and France. He studied their architecture with scholarly attention. He examined their gardens and parklands. He investigated their methods of agricultural management. He was searching for something his brothers had never sought. He wanted a purpose beyond display. His brothers built houses designed to impress New York society and force open doors that had been closed to them. George wanted something different. He imagined an estate that would be not merely grand, but genuinely productive. Not merely beautiful, but sustainably managed for generations. He dreamed of combining American ambition with European cultivation, creating something that would endure beyond the brief lifetimes of those who built it. In the late 1880s, George began looking for land far from the competitive arena of New York and Newport. He found it in the mountains of North Carolina, in country so remote that his family could not understand why he wanted it. But George saw something there that they could not perceive. He saw the place where he would build not just a house, but a world. George Washington Vanderbilt first visited Asheville, North Carolina in 1888. He was 26 years old and traveling with his mother, Maria Louisa, who sought relief from a persistent respiratory ailment. The mountain air of western North Carolina had gained a reputation for healing properties. Physicians recommended it for patients suffering from tuberculosis and other lung conditions. The Vanderbilts arrived expecting a brief therapeutic stay. George found something else entirely. The Blue Ridge Mountains in that era presented a landscape of stark contrasts. The peaks themselves were ancient and beautiful, worn smooth by millions of years of erosion into gentle slopes covered with hardwood forests. But the valleys told a different story. Decades of exploitative farming had exhausted the soil. Timber companies had clear-cut vast swaths of hillside, leaving behind eroded slopes and silted streams. The local population lived in grinding poverty. Most families survived on subsistence agriculture, growing just enough corn and tobacco to feed themselves and perhaps sell a small surplus. The region had never recovered from the Civil War. Roads were primitive. Rail connections were sparse. Asheville itself was a small town of perhaps 10,000 residents, serving mainly as a health resort for wealthy visitors from the lowland South. George saw something in this damaged landscape that others missed. Where local farmers saw exhausted fields, he saw land that could be restored. Where timber barons saw profits already extracted, he saw forests that could be regrown. The very poverty of the region meant that land was extraordinarily cheap. Farms that had supported families for generations could be purchased for a few dollars per acre. George began to imagine possibilities that had nothing to do with Fifth Avenue society or Newport competition. His first purchases were modest. In 1888 and 1889, he acquired several hundred acres through local agents who kept his identity secret. The sellers had no idea they were dealing with one of the richest young men in America. They knew only that someone was buying worn-out farmland at prices that seemed generous for such unpromising property. George paid between $2 and $10 per acre for most of these early acquisitions. Some parcels cost even less. The secrecy served multiple purposes. It kept prices low by preventing sellers from demanding premiums once they learned who was buying. It also gave George time to develop his vision without interference from family members who might have tried to redirect his plans. His brothers were consumed with their Newport and Fifth Avenue projects. They paid little attention to George's quiet movements in the Carolina mountains. By the time anyone in the family understood what he was doing, he had already assembled thousands of acres. George's vision crystallized during these early years. He did not want a summer cottage like Marble House or a display palace like 660's Fifth Avenue. He wanted an estate in the European tradition, a working agricultural enterprise that would sustain itself and improve the land it occupied. He had studied the great English country houses during his travels abroad. He had visited French chateaux and German estates. What impressed him was not merely their architecture, but their integration with the surrounding landscape. These were not isolated monuments, but centers of agricultural production, forestry management, and rural community life. The model he found most compelling was the English estate system at its best. A great house served as the hub of a productive enterprise. Farms supplied food. Forests provided timber and game. Villages housed workers who maintained the property across generations. The estate owner was not merely a resident but a steward, responsible for the land and the people who depended on it. This was utterly different from the Vanderbilt mansions in New York, which existed purely for display and required constant infusions of cash from railroad dividends. George wanted to prove that American land could support the same kind of integrated enterprise. More than that, he wanted to demonstrate that damaged land could be healed. The worn-out farms of western North Carolina would become his laboratory. He would restore the forests that timber companies had destroyed. He would rebuild the soil that careless agriculture had depleted. He would create employment for local families who had known only poverty. The house itself, however grand, would serve this larger purpose. By 1889, George had acquired enough land to begin serious planning. His holdings now exceeded 2,000 acres and continued to grow with each passing month. He contacted Richard Morris Hunt, the most prestigious architect in America, and Frederick Law Olmsted, the landscape designer who had created Central Park. Both men were in their 60s. Both had worked for the Vanderbilt family before. Hunt had designed Marble House for William K. and was already working on the breakers for Cornelius II. Olmsted had consulted on landscaping projects for several family properties. George invited both men to visit Asheville and see what he had in mind. They arrived in the summer of 1889, expecting perhaps another Newport cottage or country retreat. What George showed them was something far more ambitious. He took them on horseback rides across his growing holdings. He walked them through the damaged forests. He showed them the eroded hillsides and the impoverished farms. Then he explained what he wanted to create. Hunt was initially skeptical. The scale George described seemed impossible. A house larger than any private residence in America, surrounded by a working agricultural estate that would eventually encompass over 100,000 acres. The construction challenges alone were daunting. There were no adequate roads to bring in materials. No local workforce possessed the skills needed for fine construction. Everything would have to be imported or taught from scratch. Olmsted saw different problems. The land was severely damaged. Restoring it would require not years, but decades of careful management. The forests needed replanting with scientific methods that barely existed in America at that time. The soil needed rebuilding through techniques that most American farmers had never heard of. Creating what George envisioned would require inventing an entirely new approach to land management. But both men recognized something remarkable in their young client. George was not interested in shortcuts or compromises. He wanted to do this correctly, whatever the cost, whatever the time required. He was willing to spend his fortune not on competitive display, but on genuine creation. Hunt and Olmsted agreed to take on the project. It would become the defining work of both their careers. Over the next 2 years, George accelerated his land purchases. The holdings grew to 10,000 acres, then 20,000, then 50,000. He bought entire communities, absorbing villages whose residents became his employees. He purchased timber rights from companies that had already stripped the trees, intending to regrow what they had destroyed. By 1891, his holdings approached 100,000 acres. The total would eventually reach 125,000, an area larger than the entire city of Atlanta. If you find this story fascinating, take a moment to subscribe to support the channel. It means a lot. And I also welcome you to share your opinions in the comments below. The purchases attracted attention that George could no longer avoid. Local newspapers reported on the mysterious buyer who was assembling an empire in the mountains. National publications began to investigate. When reporters finally confirmed that the buyer was a Vanderbilt, the story became a sensation. What was this quiet young millionaire planning to do with more land than some European principalities? George offered no public explanation. He simply continued buying and continued planning. The house that would rise from these mountains was still years away from construction, but the land was secured. The vision was clear. Now he needed the men who could make it real. Richard Morris Hunt would design the greatest house of his career. Frederick Law Olmsted would create landscapes that would outlive them all. And a young forester named Gifford Pinchot would pioneer methods that would eventually transform American conservation. Together, they would build something that none of the other Vanderbilts had ever imagined. Richard Morris Hunt was 61 years old when George Vanderbilt asked him to design a house unlike anything America had ever seen. Hunt was the Dean of American Architects, the first American to study at the prestigious École des Beaux-Arts in Paris. He had designed mansions for the Astors, libraries for universities, and the pedestal for the Statue of Liberty. For the Vanderbilt family alone, he had already created Marble House and was completing work on the breakers. No architect in the country commanded more respect or higher fees. Hunt brought to the Biltmore project not merely technical skill, but a philosophy of architecture rooted in European tradition. He believed that great buildings should reflect the landscape and culture that surrounded them. They should use local materials where possible. They should honor historical precedents while adapting them to modern needs. The chateau style he proposed for Biltmore drew inspiration from the Loire Valley of France, where Renaissance aristocrats had built country estates that balanced grandeur with livability. The specific model Hunt studied was the Chateau de Blois, with its famous spiral staircase and its blend of medieval fortress and Renaissance palace. But Hunt did not intend mere imitation. He wanted to translate French principles into American reality. The result would be something new, a house that evoked European tradition while serving distinctly American purposes. Frederick Law Olmsted was 67 when he joined the project. His reputation exceeded even Hunt's. Olmsted had designed Central Park in Manhattan, Prospect Park in Brooklyn, the grounds of the United States Capitol, and dozens of other landscapes that had shaped American understanding of public space. He was a visionary who believed that designed landscapes could improve human character. Parks and gardens were not luxuries but necessities for civilized life. Olmsted arrived at Biltmore with health already failing. He suffered from chronic insomnia and bouts of depression that would eventually force his retirement. But the challenge George presented rekindled his energy. Here was a chance to do something he had never attempted before. Not a public park or a private garden, but an entire managed landscape, encompassing tens of thousands of acres. The two men approached the project from opposite directions that would eventually meet in creative tension. Hunt wanted formal gardens surrounding the house, geometric patterns of flowers and hedges that would frame his architecture properly. He envisioned terraces descending from the main structure, Italian-style gardens with fountains and statuary, approaches that would reveal the chateau gradually to arriving visitors. Olmsted resisted this vision initially. He had spent his career fighting against the artificiality of formal European gardens. He believed that American landscapes should embrace their natural character rather than impose imported patterns. The mountains around Asheville were beautiful in their wild state. Why force them into French geometries? But as Olmsted studied the site more carefully, he recognized that the damaged land required intervention. This was not pristine wilderness to be preserved. It was exhausted farmland and stripped forest that needed restoration. The question was not whether to manage the landscape, but how. Gradually, he developed a compromise that would define Biltmore's grounds. Near the house, Olmsted accepted Hunt's formal gardens. The immediate surroundings would feature the terraces and geometric plantings that the architecture demanded. A 4-acre walled garden would provide flowers for the house and vegetables for the kitchen. An Italian garden would offer a classical counterpoint to the French chateau. These design spaces would serve as a transition between the monumental architecture and the natural landscape beyond. But beyond these formal areas, Olmsted planned something far more ambitious. He proposed transforming the damaged forests into a managed woodland that would demonstrate scientific principles of sustainable forestry. The eroded hillsides would be replanted with species chosen for long-term forest health rather than quick timber harvest. The streams would be protected by buffer zones that prevented erosion. The entire landscape would become a laboratory for conservation practices that barely existed in America. To implement this vision, Olmsted recruited a young man named Gifford Pinchot. At just 25 years old, Pinchot was one of the only Americans with formal training in European forestry methods. He had studied in France and Germany, learning techniques that had sustained European forests for centuries, while American forests were being stripped bare. He was passionate, ambitious, and eager to prove that scientific forestry could work in the United States. Pinchot arrived at Biltmore in 1891 and immediately began cataloging the forest resources. What he found confirmed Olmsted's assessment. Decades of careless logging had removed the most valuable trees. The remaining forest consisted largely of damaged specimens and weedy species that had colonized abandoned clearings. Soil erosion had stripped nutrients from hillsides. Streams ran brown with sediment after every rain. The restoration plan Pinchot developed was methodical and long-term. He divided the forest into management units and prescribed different treatments for each based on its condition. Some areas needed complete replanting. Others required selective harvesting to remove damaged trees and allow healthy ones to mature. Fire management, entirely absent from American forestry practice at that time, became part of the program. Pinchot trained local workers in techniques that were new to them. He established a nursery to grow seedlings for replanting. This work would take decades to show results. Pinchot himself would leave after just 3 years to pursue a career in government service. He eventually became the first chief of the United States Forest Service, applying lessons learned at Biltmore to the entire national forest system. But the forestry program he established continued under his successors. Biltmore would become home to the first school of forestry in America, training the professionals who would eventually manage public and private forests across the nation. While Olmsted and Pinchot worked on the landscape, Hunt refined his architectural plans. The house grew larger with each revision. George's ambitions expanded as he saw the site take shape. What had begun as a large country house became something approaching a palace. The final design called for approximately 175,000 square feet of floor space. The structure would contain 250 rooms. It would be the largest private residence in the United States. The architectural style Hunt chose blended French Gothic and Renaissance elements. The roofline featured steep pitches and elaborate chimneys reminiscent of 16th century chateaux. The entrance facade presented a formal symmetry punctuated by towers and turrets. But Hunt also incorporated innovations that purely historical models lacked. The floor plan organized spaces for efficient household operation. Service areas connected logically to the rooms they supported. Modern mechanical systems would be integrated from the beginning rather than added awkwardly later. Hunt understood that this house needed to function as more than a showpiece. George intended to live here, to manage his estate from here, to entertain guests for extended visits. The house required practical organization that pure display architecture often neglected. Kitchens needed to connect efficiently to dining rooms. Servant circulation needed to remain invisible to guests. Storage needed to accommodate the supplies required by a self-sufficient estate far from urban suppliers. The collaboration between Hunt and Olmsted was not always smooth. Both men were accustomed to having their visions prevail. Both were aging and increasingly conscious of their legacies. They disagreed about approach roads, about the placement of service buildings, about how visitors should first glimpse the house. George mediated these disputes with patience that surprised both men. He listened carefully to each argument. He sought compromises that preserved what each collaborator valued most. By 1892, the plans were essentially complete. Hunt had produced drawings for a house that would cost more than any private residence in American history. Olmsted had designed a landscape that would take a generation to mature. Penshow had begun the forestry work that would eventually restore more than 100,000 acres. The vision was set. Now came the challenge of actually building it. Hunt would not live to see his masterpiece completed. His health declined sharply during the construction years. He died in July 1895, just months before the house opened to its first guests. Olmsted lasted longer, but descended into mental illness that forced his retirement. He spent his final years in an asylum, unable to recognize the landscapes he had created. Both men poured their last creative energies into Biltmore. It became, in many ways, the culmination of two remarkable American careers. Construction began in earnest in 1889, and it transformed the mountains around Asheville into the largest private building site in American history. At the peak of activity, approximately 1,000 workers labored on the estate. They came from the surrounding counties, from distant cities, and from as far away as Europe. Many had never seen a construction project of this scale. Most would spend years of their lives bringing George Vanderbilt's vision into reality. The first challenge was simply reaching the site. No adequate roads existed to carry the massive amounts of material the project would require. George commissioned a 3-mile private railroad spur connecting the estate to the main Southern Railway line. This allowed trainloads of limestone, lumber, and equipment to arrive directly at the construction zone. Workers laid track through terrain that had defeated earlier engineering attempts. The railroad alone cost hundreds of thousands of dollars. Limestone for the exterior walls came from a quarry in Indiana. George selected this material for its durability and its warm buff color that would complement the mountain landscape. Quarry workers cut massive blocks weighing several tons each. Railroad cars carried them across half the country to Asheville. At the site, stonemasons shaped each block by hand, fitting them together with precision that would allow the walls to stand for centuries. The workforce required housing, and George built an entire village to accommodate them. Biltmore Village rose on land adjacent to the construction site. It featured cottages for workers and their families, a church, a school, shops, and a hospital. The village was designed in a unified architectural style that complemented the estate itself. George intended it to remain after construction ended, providing permanent homes for the employees who would maintain the completed property. This was not mere charity. George understood that a well-housed workforce would be more productive and more loyal. He also understood that the estate would require permanent staff for generations to come. The village ensured that skilled workers would have reason to stay in the area, rather than drifting away once the main construction ended. Many families who settled in Biltmore village during the construction years remained for generations. The house itself rose slowly through the early 1890s. Foundation work began in 1889 and continued for more than a year. The walls followed, course by course, rising against the mountain backdrop. Workers installed iron structural beams that would support the massive stone exterior. They poured concrete for floors that would bear the weight of heavy furniture and large gatherings. The complexity of the construction required coordination that tested the limits of 19th century project management. Hunt's design called for technological systems that were cutting edge for the era. The house would have electricity throughout, generated by a private power plant on the estate. This was remarkable at a time when most American homes still relied on gas lighting or kerosene lamps. The electrical system would power not merely lights, but also a central vacuum system, mechanical dumbwaiters, and the first residential heating system controlled by thermostats. Indoor plumbing extended throughout the structure. The house would eventually contain 43 bathrooms, an almost unimaginable luxury, when many wealthy homes still relied on outhouses and chamber pots. Hot and cold running water reached every floor. A swimming pool in the basement offered heated water for year-round use. The pool alone was a marvel, located indoors at a time when such facilities existed only in the most advanced private clubs. The heating system used a central boiler that distributed steam through radiators in every room. This was not unusual for large buildings, but the sophistication of the controls was unprecedented. Thermostats in individual rooms allowed occupants to adjust temperatures to their preference. The system could maintain comfortable warmth even during the coldest mountain winters, while avoiding the overheating that plagued cruder installations. Fire safety received careful attention. The construction used fireproof materials wherever possible. Concrete floors and stone walls would not burn. Metal structural elements replaced the wooden beams that had contributed to devastating fires in other grand houses. A fire alarm system connected to a central station allowed rapid response to any outbreak. These precautions reflected lessons learned from fires that had destroyed other mansions of the era. Inside, craftsmen created spaces of extraordinary richness. The entrance hall featured a limestone staircase that spiraled upward beneath a painted ceiling. The banquet hall could seat 64 guests at a single table beneath walls hung with flags and medieval weaponry. The library contained approximately 23,000 volumes collected by George over 2 decades of traveling and book hunting. The library deserves particular attention because it reveals so much about its creator. George Vanderbilt was among the most serious book collectors of his generation. He read 8 languages and collected in all of them. The shelves held first editions, rare manuscripts, and complete sets of major authors. A 2-story ceiling allowed for a gallery level with additional shelving. A massive fireplace provided warmth for winter reading. This was not a decorative room assembled by designers. It was the working library of a genuine scholar. Other rooms reflected different aspects of George's interests and personality. The music room featured an organ that could fill the space with sound. The breakfast room offered intimate dining for family and close friends. The bachelor's wing provided comfortable quarters for male guests. The corresponding areas for female guests maintained strict separation according to the social conventions of the era. The basement level contained facilities that made the house largely self-sufficient. A kitchen capable of preparing meals for hundreds featured the latest equipment available. Pantries stored provisions that could sustain the household through weeks of isolation. Laundry facilities processed linens and clothing without requiring anything to leave the premises. Servants' quarters housed the permanent staff in conditions that were comfortable by the standards of the time. The art collection George assembled for the house drew from centuries of European and American creativity. He purchased works by Renoir, Sargent, and Whistler. He acquired tapestries from medieval workshops. He bought furniture that had belonged to European aristocrats. The collection was not assembled for investment or display, but for living with. George wanted art around him constantly, integrated into daily life, rather than isolated in galleries. By 1895, the main construction was essentially complete. The house had cost approximately $6 million, a sum equivalent to well over $100 million today. The surrounding landscape work continued, but the structure itself stood ready for occupancy. George planned a grand opening celebration for Christmas Eve. He invited family and friends to witness what his vision had created. The guests who arrived that December found themselves in a house unlike anything in America. They entered through the front doors into an entrance hall that soared to a painted ceiling. They dined in a banquet hall beneath triple fireplaces. They relaxed in a library that rivaled university collections. They explored gardens that were still maturing but already showed the promise of Olmsted's design. George Vanderbilt, the quiet youngest son who had avoided his brother's competitive display, had built something that surpassed them all. Not in mere size, though the house was certainly the largest. Not in mere cost, though the expense had been extraordinary. He had built something that served a purpose beyond impressing society. He had created an integrated estate that would demonstrate how land could be managed sustainably, how forests could be restored, how a great house could support, rather than simply consume. For a few brief years, George enjoyed what he had created. He married Edith Stuyvesant Dresser in 1898. They traveled together, entertained together, began building a family together. Their daughter Cornelia was born in 1900, the heir to everything her father had built. The future seemed secure, but the 20th century was approaching, and it would bring challenges that neither George nor Edith could have anticipated. George Vanderbilt met Edith Stuyvesant Dresser in Paris during the summer of 1897. She was 34 years old, well-educated, and from a distinguished American family that traced its lineage to Peter Stuyvesant, the last Dutch governor of New Amsterdam. Unlike many society women of her era, Edith had lived independently for years, supporting herself as a companion to wealthy travelers and managing her own modest affairs. She was practical, intelligent, and utterly unpretentious. George was 35, still unmarried, and had spent most of his adult life building the estate that now awaited a mistress. Contemporary accounts suggest the attraction was immediate and mutual. George appreciated Edith's quiet competence and genuine interest in ideas. Edith recognized in George a kindred spirit, someone who valued substance over display. They were married in Paris on June 1st, 1898, in a ceremony attended by American ambassadors and European aristocrats. The honeymoon lasted nearly a year. The couple traveled through Europe, visiting the estates and gardens that had inspired Biltmore's design. They collected art and furnishings for the rooms that still needed filling. They began to imagine the life they would build together in the North Carolina mountains. When they finally returned to Biltmore in the autumn of 1899, Edith assumed management of the household with efficiency that impressed everyone who observed her. Cornelius Stuyvesant Vanderbilt was born on August 22, 1900. She was the only child George and Edith would have, the sole heir to everything her father had created. Her birth was celebrated throughout the region. The workers who had built Biltmore, the farmers who supplied it, the villagers who depended on it all understood that this child represented continuity. The estate now had a future generation. For the next decade, life at Biltmore settled into comfortable patterns. George continued his scholarly pursuits, adding to his library and corresponding with collectors and academics around the world. Edith managed the household and the social calendar, hosting guests who came from New York, Washington, and Europe. Cornelia grew up in an environment unlike any other American childhood. She had 250 rooms to explore, thousands of acres to wander, and the attention of parents who genuinely enjoyed her company. But the economics of the estate were troubling from the beginning. George had spent approximately $6 million on the house alone. The land purchases had cost millions more. The ongoing operation required a staff of hundreds, including household servants, farm workers, foresters, and maintenance crews. The estate generated some income from dairy operations and timber sales, but nothing approaching what it consumed. George had inherited approximately $10 million from his father. The trust funds provided additional income, but even Vanderbilt money had limits. By 1900, the estate was draining resources faster than they could be replenished. George began looking for ways to reduce the burden without abandoning his vision. The solution he found was characteristically thoughtful. Rather than sell land to private developers who might exploit it, George offered a massive portion of his holdings to the federal government. In 1914, he arranged to donate approximately 87,000 acres to create what would become Pisgah National Forest. This land had been the focus of Gifford Pinchot's forestry work and Carl Schenk's forestry school. It represented the sustainable forest management that George had championed since the beginning. The donation accomplished several goals simultaneously. It removed the burden of managing nearly 90,000 acres from the estate's accounts. It preserved the land from exploitation in perpetuity. It demonstrated that private conservation efforts could contribute to public benefit. The remaining 30-odd thousand acres still constituted an enormous estate, but one more manageable for a family without unlimited resources. George did not live to see the donation completed. On March 6, 1914, he underwent an emergency appendectomy at a hospital in Washington, D.C. The surgery itself went smoothly, but complications developed in the following days. Infection set in, spreading despite the best efforts of his physicians. On March 6, 1914, George Washington Vanderbilt II died of complications from surgery. He was 51 years old. The news reached Biltmore within hours. Edith had remained in North Carolina, expecting her husband to return within weeks. Instead, she received word that she was now a widow with a 13-year-old daughter and the largest private home in America. The staff who had served George for decades gathered in the Great Hall, many of them weeping. The man who had created their world was gone. George's funeral was held in Washington, followed by burial in the family plot on Staten Island, where his grandfather, the Commodore, also rested. Edith accompanied the body north, then returned to Biltmore to face the challenge of managing what her husband had left behind. She was 50 years old, wealthy by most standards, but not by Vanderbilt standards, and responsible for an estate that had always required more money than it produced. The will left everything to Edith and Cornelia, but the inheritance was complicated. Much of George's wealth had been consumed by the estate itself. The remaining liquid assets were modest compared to the ongoing costs of operation. Edith faced a choice that would determine whether Biltmore survived or joined the growing list of great houses that were being abandoned and demolished across America. She could sell. Developers had already expressed interest in the property. The land alone was worth millions if broken into smaller parcels. The house might find a buyer, perhaps a hotel company or a government institution. Many widows in her position would have taken the money and retreated to a more manageable life elsewhere. Edith chose differently. She would keep the estate. She would find ways to make it sustainable. She would preserve what George had built for the daughter they had raised together. This decision required immediate economies. The staff was reduced. Programs were curtailed. The forestry school closed. The dairy operations were reorganized for efficiency rather than experimentation. But Edith also recognized that mere cost-cutting would not be enough. The estate needed income beyond what agriculture and timber could provide. She began exploring an idea that no Vanderbilt had ever seriously considered. She would open the house to paying visitors. She would invite the public into the private world that George had created. she would turn Biltmore into a business. This was a radical notion in 1914. Great houses were private by definition. Opening them to tourists seemed like an admission of failure, a confession that the family could no longer afford exclusivity. Other wealthy families facing similar pressures simply demolished their white elephants rather than expose them to public gaze. The wreckage of Vanderbilt mansions in New York and Newport testified to this preference for destruction over democratization. Edith delayed the decision for more than a decade. She hoped that Cornelius' eventual marriage might bring resources that would make public access unnecessary. She watched as other Vanderbilt properties fell one by one to the wrecking ball. She maintained Biltmore as best she could through the difficult years of the First World War and the uncertain 1920s. But the economic logic was inescapable. Without additional income, the estate would eventually consume what remained of the family resources. By 1930, Edith was ready to try something unprecedented. She would open the doors that George Vanderbilt had built for his family and invite strangers to walk through them. The experiment would either save Biltmore or prove that such places had no future in modern America. While Edith Vanderbilt struggled to preserve Biltmore, her husband's relatives were demolishing their own mansions with astonishing speed. The houses that had once lined Fifth Avenue, the palaces that had represented the pinnacle of Gilded Age ambition, were falling one after another to the wrecking ball. Understanding what happened to these other Vanderbilt properties reveals just how remarkable Biltmore's survival would prove to be. The destruction began in 1914, the same year George died. William Henry Vanderbilt's original mansion at 640 Fifth Avenue was torn down to make way for commercial development. This was the house where George had grown up, the house his father had built to announce the family's arrival among New York's elite. It had stood for barely 30 years. The land beneath it was now worth more than any residence could justify. The pace of demolition accelerated through the 1920s. In 1926, William Kissam Vanderbilt's townhouse at 660 Fifth Avenue fell to developers. This was the French Renaissance chateau that had cost $3 million to build in 1882. It had launched Alva Vanderbilt's assault on New York society. Now it became rubble to make room for an office building. The demolition took weeks. Crowds gathered daily to watch another symbol of the Gilded Age disappear. 1 year later, in 1927, the largest of all the Manhattan Vanderbilt mansions met the same fate. Cornelius Vanderbilt II's house at Furrens, West 57th Street, had been the grandest private residence in the city. It contained over 100 rooms. Its entrance hall soared 3 stories high. Its art collection rivaled small museums. The house had cost approximately $5 million to build and furnish. It sold for less than $2 million, and the buyers wanted only the land. The wrecking crews arrived in the spring of 1927. Workers stripped the interiors first, selling fixtures and fittings to salvage dealers. The carved mantelpieces went to collectors. The ironwork went to scrap merchants. Then the walls came down, floor by floor, room by room. By autumn, nothing remained but a cleared lot awaiting a new skyscraper. The entire demolition had taken less than 6 months. What drove this destruction? The economics of urban real estate had shifted decisively against residential use. Land values in Manhattan had risen so high that even the wealthiest families could not justify occupying entire blocks for single homes. Property taxes consumed fortunes. Maintenance costs never ended. Staff requirements were enormous. A house like 6th and 65th Avenue required dozens of servants to operate. Finding and keeping qualified staff became increasingly difficult as other employment options expanded. The federal income tax, established in 1913, transformed the financial calculus of great wealth. Before the tax, fortunes could compound almost without limit. After it, even the richest families found their accumulations eroding. The top marginal rate climbed from 7% in 1913 to 77% by 1918. Maintaining a 100-room mansion on Fifth Avenue began to seem not merely extravagant, but mathematically impossible. Estate taxes compounded the problem. When a Vanderbilt died, the government now claimed a substantial portion of the inheritance before heirs received anything. Each generational transfer shrank the family fortune further. The houses that one generation had built, the next generation often could not afford to keep. Social changes mattered as much as financial ones. The world that had built these mansions no longer existed. The elaborate entertaining that justified enormous ballrooms and dining rooms had faded after the First World War. Younger generations preferred apartments and hotel living to the burdens of household management. Servants who had once been plentiful and cheap now had better options in factories and offices. The entire infrastructure that supported Gilded Age living was dissolving. The Newport cottages fared somewhat better than the Manhattan mansions, but only somewhat. Marble House, the palace William Kissam had built for Alva, stood empty for years after her death. The furnishings were auctioned, the maintenance was deferred. By the 1930s, the house was a shell of its former glory, preserved more by neglect than by intention. It would eventually be donated to the Preservation Society of Newport County rather than demolished, but donation was itself a form of surrender. The Breakers, Cornelius II's 70-room Italian palace, followed a similar trajectory. The costs of maintaining such a structure exceeded any reasonable return. The family considered demolition, considered sale, considered simply walking away. In 1948, the Preservation Society leased the property from Countess Szechenyi, the last family member to live there. The house was open to tourists while the Countess retained a small apartment on the upper floor. She lived there until her death in 1965, the last Vanderbilt to inhabit the home her father had built. This pattern repeated across the country. The great houses of the Gilded Age were falling everywhere. The Frick Mansion in New York became a museum. The Flagler Estates in Florida became hotels and government buildings. The Morgan properties were donated to institutions. The model of the private palace was dying. The 20th century had no place for 100-room houses maintained by armies of servants for the pleasure of single families. Against this backdrop, Biltmore's survival seems almost miraculous. The house was larger than any of the demolished Manhattan mansions. It was more remote, harder to reach, less attractive to potential institutional buyers. Its operating costs were enormous. Everything that had doomed the other Vanderbilt properties applied with equal force to the Asheville estate. Yet Biltmore had advantages that the urban mansions lacked. The land itself had value beyond mere real estate speculation. The farms and forests produced income, however modest. The setting attracted visitors in ways that a Fifth Avenue address never could. And Edith Vanderbilt had a determination that her husband's cousins and nephews apparently lacked. She would not tear down what George had built. She would not surrender to the economics that had claimed the other family homes. Edith watched the demolitions from North Carolina. She read the newspaper accounts of wrecking balls crashing through marble halls. She understood that the forces destroying those houses would eventually reach Biltmore unless she found another path. The other Vanderbilts had chosen to destroy rather than adapt. Edith would choose differently. Her solution would transform not just Biltmore, but the very concept of what a great house could become in democratic America. Where others saw white elephants fit only for demolition, Edith saw an opportunity. Where others abandoned the past, she would invite the public to share it. On March 15, 1930, the front doors of Biltmore House swung open for paying visitors for the first time. The timing was terrible and perfect simultaneously. The stock market had crashed just 5 months earlier. The Great Depression was beginning its long descent into economic catastrophe. Families across America were losing their savings, their jobs, their homes. Banks were failing by the hundreds. Bread lines stretched around city blocks. This was the moment Edith Vanderbilt chose to invite strangers into the largest private residence in the country. The The decision had been years in the making. Edith had considered public access since George's death in 1914. She had delayed repeatedly, hoping that other solutions might emerge. She had watched her husband's relatives demolish their Manhattan mansions rather than open them to the public. She had seen the Breakers and Marble House stand empty and deteriorating in Newport. She understood that opening Biltmore represented a break with everything the Vanderbilt family had stood for, but she also understood that the alternative was losing the house entirely. Her daughter Cornelia had married John Francis Amherst Cecil in 1924 at a lavish ceremony in the Biltmore Gardens. The match had seemed promising. John Cecil came from an old English family with connections to the Cecil dynasty that had served British monarchs for centuries. His grandfather was the third Marquess of Exeter, but the Cecils, while distinguished in lineage, were not Vanderbilt wealthy. The marriage brought Cornelia companionship and social standing, but not the financial rescue that Biltmore desperately needed. John Cecil proved to be a capable manager who cared genuinely about the estate, but he could not conjure money that the family simply did not have. Edith herself had remarried in 1925. Her second husband was Senator Peter Golette Gerry of Rhode Island, a member of another old American fortune, though one considerably smaller than the Vanderbilts had once possessed. The marriage took Edith away from Biltmore for extended periods. She divided her time between Rhode Island and North Carolina, spending winters in the South and summers in the Northeast. The arrangement left day-to-day management increasingly to Cornelia and John Cecil, but Edith remained the final authority on major decisions. When the time came to open the house, it was Edith who made the choice. The opening in 1930 was presented carefully to the public. Edith framed her decision not as an admission of financial necessity, but as a civic contribution during a time of national crisis. Asheville's business leaders had been urging tourist development for years. The city had built its economy partly on wealthy visitors seeking the healthful mountain climate. The Depression threatened to destroy that economy entirely. Hotels stood empty, restaurants closed. Workers who had depended on tourism found themselves without employment. Edith positioned the opening as her response to community need. Western North Carolina was suffering terribly. Opening Biltmore would create jobs for local residents. It would attract visitors who would spend money at Asheville hotels and restaurants. It would provide an attraction that might draw tourists even during hard times. The argument was genuine as far as it went, but it also served to deflect attention from the family's own financial pressures. The proud Vanderbilts would help their neighbors, not admit that they needed help themselves. The first visitors paid $2 each for admission. This was a substantial sum during the Depression, equivalent to perhaps $30 or $40 today. Many American families were surviving on less than $2 per day at the height of the crisis. Yet people came. They came by automobile from nearby cities. They came by train from distant states. They came because they wanted to see how the rich had lived, how the rich still lived, in a time when ordinary Americans were losing everything. For that $2 price, visitors received a guided tour through the main floors of the house. Trained guides led small groups through a carefully planned route. The tour began in the entrance hall with its massive limestone staircase, spiraling upward beneath a painted ceiling. Visitors walked through the banquet hall, where triple fireplaces framed a table that could seat 64 guests. They admired the library with its 23,000 volumes, rising 2 stories to an ornate ceiling. They glimpsed bedrooms and sitting rooms, furnished with artwork and antiques that most Americans had seen only in magazines. The guides told stories as they walked. They explained who George Vanderbilt was and why he had built such a house. They described the construction process, the army of workers, the years of effort. They pointed out details of craftsmanship that visitors might otherwise overlook. They made the house feel not like a cold museum, but like a home, albeit one on an almost incomprehensible scale. This personal touch distinguished Biltmore from institutional house museums. Visitors felt they were guests, not merely ticket holders. The response exceeded all expectations. Despite the economic crisis, or perhaps precisely because of it, Americans craved escapism. They wanted to forget their troubles for an afternoon. They wanted to imagine lives different from their own. They wanted stories of wealth and grandeur that contrasted with the hardships surrounding them. Biltmore provided all of this and more. Visitors came by the thousands in that first year. Word spread, and the thousands became tens of thousands. The income from admissions was modest at first, but grew steadily through the 1930s. More importantly, the revenue established a principle that would guide the estate for generations. The house could contribute to its own maintenance. The estate need not rely entirely on dwindling family resources. A new economic model was emerging, one that balanced private ownership with public access. No major American historic house had successfully implemented such a model before. Cornelia and John Cecil took increasing responsibility for daily operations as the decade progressed. They lived at Biltmore with their two sons, George Henry Vanderbilt Cecil and William Amherst Vanderbilt Cecil, born in 1925 and 1928 respectively. The boys grew up in the house their great-grandfather had built, the fifth generation of the family to call Biltmore home, but their childhood differed dramatically from what previous generations had known. They shared their home with strangers every single day. They watched tourists walk through rooms where they ate breakfast and played games. They learned early that Biltmore belonged not just to them, but in some meaningful sense to everyone who paid the admission price. This unusual childhood would shape both brothers profoundly. They understood from their earliest years that Biltmore's survival depended on public engagement. They absorbed the lesson that great houses could not exist as isolated private preserves in modern America. They would eventually take control of the estate and transform it into something their ancestors could never have imagined. But that transformation lay decades in the future. Through the 1930s and 1940s, the family focused simply on survival. The Depression years were difficult, but manageable. The house remained open even as other attractions closed. Visitor numbers fluctuated with economic conditions but never collapsed entirely. The Second World War brought new challenges. Gasoline rationing limited automobile travel. Many young men who might have visited were overseas fighting. But the war also brought unexpected benefits. In 1942, the National Gallery of Art approached the family with an unusual request. The gallery needed a secure location to store its most valuable paintings, safe from the risk of enemy bombing that seemed plausible in the war's early years. Biltmore's remote location and fireproof construction made it an ideal repository. For several years, masterpieces by Rembrandt, Vermeer, and other old masters resided in the music room and adjoining spaces. When the war ended and the paintings returned to Washington, Biltmore could claim to have served the nation during its hour of need. The post-war years brought gradual stabilization. Automobile ownership expanded dramatically. Americans had money to spend on travel and leisure. The interstate highway system made remote destinations accessible. Biltmore benefited from all these trends. Visitor numbers climbed through the 1950s and continued climbing into the 1960s. The experimental opening of 1930 had become a permanent institution. Edith Vanderbilt Gerry died in 1958 at the age of 85. She had outlived George by 44 years. She had navigated the estate through its most precarious decades. She had made the decision that saved Biltmore from the fate of every other major Vanderbilt property. She had watched the houses of Fifth Avenue and Newport fall while hers stood. Without her willingness to open the doors, without her practical determination, Biltmore would almost certainly have been demolished or donated long before her death. Cornelia's life followed a more troubled path. Her marriage to John Cecil ended in divorce in 1934, a scandalous event in that era. She left Biltmore and eventually settled in England, where she lived quietly until her death in 1976. She never returned to live in the house where she had been born. She saw her childhood home only as an occasional visitor. The estate passed effectively to her sons, George and William Cecil, who would guide it through the second half of the 20th century. The Cecil brothers brought different skills to their inheritance. George, the elder, had artistic sensibilities and strong opinions about historic preservation. William had studied at Harvard Business School and understood modern management techniques. They sometimes disagreed about direction and priorities, but they shared a fundamental commitment to keeping Biltmore in family hands while making it economically sustainable. That commitment would drive every major decision for the next 60 years. Today, more than 1.4 million visitors pass through Biltmore's gates each year. They drive along the approach road that Frederick Law Olmsted designed, catching their first glimpse of the chateau through carefully placed gaps in the tree canopy. They park in lots that accommodate thousands of cars and walk toward the house that George Vanderbilt built nearly 130 years ago. The limestone walls still glow buff gold in the afternoon light. The steep roof lines still bristle with chimneys and dormers. The entrance still opens into a hall that takes visitors' breath away exactly as it did when the first guests arrived on Christmas Eve 1895. The estate has transformed dramatically since Edith opened the doors in 1930. What began as simple house tours has evolved into a comprehensive hospitality enterprise. The Biltmore Winery, established in 1985 in the renovated dairy buildings, produces hundreds of thousands of cases annually. It has become one of the most visited wineries in America. The Inn on Biltmore Estate opened in 2001, offering luxury accommodations within the grounds. A second hotel, Village Hotel on Biltmore Estate, followed in 2015. Restaurants, shops, and outdoor activities now generate revenue streams that George Vanderbilt never imagined. The commercial development has drawn criticism from preservation advocates over the decades. Some argue that the hotels and winery compromise the historic character of the property. They see parking lots and gift shops where meadows and forests once stood. They worry that the pursuit of revenue has displaced the commitment to preservation that originally justified public access. These concerns are not unreasonable. Any commercial enterprise risks subordinating historical integrity to financial returns. But the Cecil family and their advisors have maintained a consistent response to such criticism. The alternative to commercial development was not pristine preservation. The alternative was the fate that befell every other major Vanderbilt property. The alternative was demolition, donation, or abandonment. The hotels and wineries exist because they generate the income that maintains the house itself. Without that income, the house would have been lost generations ago. The numbers support this argument. Biltmore employs approximately 2,400 workers during peak season. The estate contributes over $2 billion annually to the regional economy according to recent studies. The house itself receives continuous maintenance that few museum properties can match. Conservators work year-round to preserve furniture, textiles, and artwork. Structural engineers monitor the building constantly. The electrical, plumbing, and heating systems have been updated repeatedly while preserving the historic fabric they serve. This level of care requires resources that admission fees alone could never provide. The diversified revenue streams from hotels, winery, restaurants, and retail make possible the preservation work that keeps the house standing. Critics who advocate for a purer approach rarely explain how such purity would be funded. The Vanderbilt family wealth that built Biltmore dissipated generations ago. Only the income the estate generates itself maintains it now. The family ownership structure that makes this possible is itself remarkable. Biltmore remains privately held by descendants of George and Edith Vanderbilt. The company operates as a for-profit enterprise, not as a non-profit museum or public trust. This structure has proved more durable than the alternatives that other great houses adopted. Non-profit historic houses struggle constantly with fundraising and deferred maintenance. Properties owned by government agencies face budget constraints and political interference. Biltmore, operating as a business, can invest in its own future without depending on donors or taxpayers. William Cecil, who led the estate from 1960 until his death in 2017, deserves primary credit for developing this model. He understood that preservation and profit were not enemies, but allies. He invested heavily in visitor amenities because better amenities attracted more visitors who spent more money that funded more preservation. The virtuous cycle he created has sustained the estate for more than half a century. His sons now guide the enterprise. William A.B. Cecil Jr. serves as CEO, continuing the family management tradition that stretches back to John Cecil in the 1930s. The sixth generation of Vanderbilt descendants remains actively involved in the business their ancestor created. No other American great house can claim such continuity of family ownership and management. What does Biltmore mean today? The answer depends on who you ask. For the more than 1 million annual visitors, it offers a glimpse into a vanished world of wealth and privilege. They walk through rooms where Gilded Age tycoons once dined and danced. They see artwork and furnishings that represent the accumulated taste of generations. They imagine lives utterly different from their own. For the residents of Western North Carolina, Biltmore represents economic foundation. The estate is one of the largest employers in the region. The tourists it attracts support countless hotels, restaurants, and shops throughout Asheville and beyond. The city's identity as a destination for arts, culture, and fine living owes much to the anchor that Biltmore provides. For students of preservation and historic tourism, Biltmore offers a model worth studying. The estate has demonstrated that private ownership of great houses can work under the right conditions. The combination of sufficient scale, a cash and Spenstian diversified revenue, professional management, and family commitment has produced results that other preservation models have struggled to match. Not every historic property can replicate what Biltmore has achieved, but those that can should study its methods carefully. For the Vanderbilt legacy itself, Biltmore represents the sole, surviving monument of a family that once dominated American wealth. The mansions of Fifth Avenue are gone. The Newport cottages have passed to preservation societies. The railroads that created the fortune have been absorbed into larger corporations. Only Biltmore remains in family hands, still generating income, still welcoming visitors, still standing as George Vanderbilt intended it to stand. The comparison with other Vanderbilt properties underscores how unusual Biltmore's survival has been. The Breakers, magnificent as it remains, belongs to the Preservation Society of Newport County. The family gave up ownership decades ago. Marble House followed the same path. The Manhattan mansions simply vanished, replaced by office towers and apartment buildings that generate no memory of what once stood on their sites. Cornelius Vanderbilt II's great house at West 57th Street, once the largest private residence in New York City, left behind not even a plaque. Biltmore endures because one woman refused to let it die. Edith Vanderbilt could have sold or donated the property in 1914 and lived comfortably on the proceeds. She chose instead to preserve it for her daughter and her daughter's children. When preservation required public access, she accepted the compromise that other Vanderbilts rejected. When public access required commercial development, her heirs accepted that compromise too. Each generation chose survival over purity, adaptation over rigidity, future over past. The house George Vanderbilt built stands today almost exactly as he left it. Visitors entering through the front doors see the same limestone staircase he commissioned. They walk through rooms furnished with the same paintings and tapestries he collected. They look out windows at gardens that Olmsted designed and forests that Pancho began restoring more than a century ago. The continuity is remarkable. The survival is improbable. The meaning is worth contemplating. In an age when nothing seems built to last, Biltmore has lasted. In a culture that celebrates disruption and transformation, it has maintained its essential character across 130 years. In an economy that reduces everything to quarterly returns, a family has preserved an asset across 6 generations. The house that critics once called a white elephant, the folly of a shy young millionaire with more money than sense, has outlived every similar structure his relatives ever built. The gates still open each morning. The visitors still come by the thousands. The gardens still bloom through the seasons. The forests that George Vanderbilt saved from exploitation still cover the mountains that surround his creation. Biltmore survives not because it froze itself in amber, but because it found ways to change while remaining itself.